So I've just started it recording now. So yes, thank you everyone for joining us for this discussion of pushbacks and the trends that we're seeing in pushbacks. I'll start with introducing our panelists and then we'll move on to the first questions. However, to all of our audience members, I just want to say that if any questions occur to you that you would like to ask any or all of our panelists, please do type them into the chat box, or you can send them to me privately if you want to stay anonymous, and I will relay those questions to our panel. So we would very much welcome any audience feedback or questions that you may have. So I'll just start with introducing our panelists in the order that they appear on our screen. The first one I have here is Francesco Luigi Gatta. He is the Research Fellow in EU Law at the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium. He's also a visiting professor at the Tuscia University in Italy and at the Riga Graduate School of Law, where he teaches EU law, European constitutional law, and migration and asylum law. He's also a legal assistant at the European Court of Human Rights. He graduated cum laude at the University of Padua, and he holds a double PhD from the universities of Padua and Leopold Franzens Universität Innsbruck in Austria. He's been visiting researcher and research fellow in several European universities, and he's published extensively in English and Italian on topics of EU law and international law, immigration and asylum law, and human rights. Next on my screen is Ulrike Brandl. She is the assistant professor at the Department of Public Law, Public International Law and International Organizations at the University of Salzburg. Her publications, research fields and teaching activities include refugee and migration law, human rights protection, the law of international organizations, the relationship between international and national law, and sanctions as a means of law enforcement. She is a member of the Odysseus Academic Network for Legal Studies on Immigration and Asylum in Europe, and she is co-editor of the online journal FABL, which is available at www.fabl.at. Next on my screen is Rina Sarfraz. She's from New York, currently based in Pakistan. She's a senior student at Long Island University, majoring in global studies and international relations with a focus on human rights and justice. She started working with refugees in Bosnia in 2019 and has had several experiences researching and documenting pushbacks in Bosnia and between Turkey and Greece. As humanitarians continue to be targeted, she hopes to continue raising awareness of the injustices along the migratory pathway, and she's currently working with Insight Collaborative. And next on my screen is Andras Lederer. He joined the Hungarian Helsinki Committee in September 2015 as the Refugee Programme's Advocacy Officer. Before joining the team, he earned his BSc in Terrorism, Conflict and Security at Aberystwyth University and his MSc in Violence, Conflict and Development at SOAS. Although he's mostly involved in the Helsinki Committee's advocacy related to international protection and the rule of law, he takes every opportunity to be on the field. This means in practice, Serbia, where he documents often violent pushbacks for litigation purposes. Through training, network and advocacy, he also supports grassroots groups working on the issue. His PhD research focuses on the relationship between speech and trauma caused by intractable conflicts. Although he largely works on Chechnya, he left his heart in the Southern Caucasus. He considers Georgia his second home. He teaches a course he also co-developed, the Sociology of Terrorism, for BA and MA students at ELTE, Hungary's largest university. So those are our amazing panelists. Between you, you've all got so much experience in this field, so I'm really excited for this discussion. So I will leap straight into our first question, which is, can you outline your own experience of witnessing, researching and reporting on pushbacks and what trends you have seen? And if it's okay with you, we'll go with the same order that we had our introductions in. So Francesco, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel. Can you hear me properly? Yes, you can. Great. So once again, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to this very interesting webinar today. Thank you, Daniel, for your kind introduction. I'm very glad to be here today for two reasons. First of all, because we are about to discuss pushbacks and collective expulsions of aliens, which is, I think, a hot topic, very problematic issue right now. And secondly, because let me say that today it is an important birthday It's the birthday of the 1951 Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugee, which was signed today, exactly 70 years ago, the 28th of July. So it's great to be here today and discuss migration issues on this date. Coming to your question, my experience with the issue of pushbacks of migrants and asylum seekers is basically twofold, I would say. On the one hand, because of the research I pursue in the academia. As you pointed out, I'm a researcher, so I've been dealing with pushbacks and collective expulsions, doing my research, my university research. On the other hand, I also had the chance to deal with pushbacks, maybe from a more practical point of view, by working and dealing with the Court of Strasbourg, the European Court of Human Rights. I am currently assisting a judge of the court, that is Judge Wojciech, the judge of Poland. And by the way, there are a few recent important cases against Poland involving pushbacks at the border with Belarus. We might probably discuss this later. So I had the chance to a little bit to have a look at those cases and similar cases. And also I have been involved in the preparation of a third-party intervention in a case against Croatia, again about pushbacks of Syrian, in this case, Syrian asylum seekers at the border with Slovenia and Italy. So this would be my experience regarding the topic of pushbacks.
Thank you, Francesco. That's really helpful. Ulrike, could you give us your kind of experience and some of the trends that you've seen, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you for the invitation, and good afternoon to all participants and panelists. I'm dealing with pushbacks for quite a long time, but I will try to limit myself to give an overview over the last few years. But just a remark at the beginning, when I started to work in the area of refugee law, we still had communist regimes in Hungary, and it was, let me say, the final years, the changes, and we saw, I am Austrian, we saw the changes in Austria as well, of course, in the years following the political transition in Eastern Europe, and I saw the pushbacks when migrants, refugees came to Austria, and there was the military was called to assist in border controls, and then we had the safe third country notion. It was all the measures were intended to let me say, to not allow the entrance of migrants and refugees to Austria. So I watched this for quite a long time, though the notion pushback was not used at that time. When as I said, I limit myself to the last few years, I saw the pushbacks, of course, and I did research, pushbacks from Greece to Turkey before and after the EU-Turkey deal, quite an interesting legal issue as well. Then pushbacks from Turkey to Syria, pushbacks in all areas of the Mediterranean, as we all know, to Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, and so on. And of course, also to Spain, with the Spanish land borders in the Spanish enclaves, where we had the interesting case before the European Court of Human Rights. Just quite recently, we had a judgment of an Austrian administrative court. It's just a judgment from, it's a decision, not formally a judgment, but the court is an independent court. about pushbacks from Austria to Slovenia. Persons who intended to seek asylum at in Austria, but were sent back to Slovenia and ended up in Bosnia. Slovenia handed them obviously over to Croatia, and then they are, it seems they are still in Bosnia, in detention or not, that's not sure, in Bosnia. So, and the court said this is a violation. It's a pushback which is not, does not have a legal basis in Austrian law, and it's not justified. And yeah, that's really, I think, an interesting case, which I could later on report. And I think you know my name from a blog I wrote on pushbacks at the Polish-Belarusian border, where I compared with a colleague of mine, where we compared the Spanish case with the Polish case, where the court clearly said it's a violation of Article 4 Protocol for mass expulsion. And in NT we had a judgment which was heavily criticized, as we all know, not by all authors, but by many. Yeah, that's my experience. I myself don't have practical experience in the field, but working with lawyers and NGOs representing clients.
Thank you, Ulrike. That's really helpful. And you're right, it was in that blog post that I first came across you. And it must be really interesting, and also I imagine quite disheartening as well, seeing things come full circle in some ways in terms of the pushbacks that you saw at the beginning of your career with the end of communist rule, and now seeing it all happening again with the EU.
It's interesting because, you know, practice changed, the law changed, terminology changed. We didn't have the word pushback in migration and refugee law, perhaps somewhere, but it was not a well-known or often used term. So really a development over the years and decades.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. Rina, how about you? What is your experience of kind of witnessing pushbacks, and what trends have you seen?
Yeah, hi everyone, and again, thank you for having me on here. So I started volunteering, my first time volunteering was in Bosnia back in 2019. And that was just with a grassroots organization in Sarajevo. So during my time with them, that organization was mainly based on providing food and other types of aid. So the refugees that I would come across had some pretty, crazy and horrific stories of brutality they faced along the Bosnian and Croatian border. So that was my very first time hearing about the brutality of pushbacks. And there were numerous occasions where we would have individuals come in with these really sickening injuries, knife wounds, scars, things like that. And so the lack of medical aid along the Bosnian and Croatian border at that time was, there was a huge gap. So a lot of them would wait till they made it back to Sarajevo just to get medical treatment. And of course, that was really upsetting to hear. So that was my first time witnessing it. And then I came to Turkey in October, and I just recently left, and I'm now in Pakistan. But during my time in Turkey, I have been doing some informal and formal testimonies of pushbacks. And one of the trends that I've been seeing from, and again, this is just from 2019 to now, so it's not even just a big gap in years, is that the pushbacks have been getting worse. They've been happening very often. The injuries have been getting even worse. And it's like, I got to a point where I was like, I don't know anyone that hasn't been pushed back or doesn't know anyone that has been pushed back. So yeah, during my time in Turkey, talking to the refugees, mainly men, hearing how they were treated going, crossing into Greece or other Balkan countries versus the families was also really interesting. In my experience, I heard families were also beaten or, not allowed to enter, but with single men mainly, the case seemed to be that they were not seen as vulnerable, as a vulnerable group. And so they often had the worst case of the pushback. So, talking to them, for me, it was a bit weird because I'm Pakistani American. So I talked to a lot of Pakistanis and Afghans who speak Urdu because they either grew up here or crossed into Pakistan while making their way. And, listening to their stories and coming from similar towns was, it was really odd. And seeing that the lack of hope they have in, the future of their own home countries, but not just their home countries, but their host countries as well. I don't really have any words for that. They're already upset that, amongst obviously a bunch of other emotions that they had to leave for whatever reason, and now having to face this while on the migratory pathway, that's just another thing that they don't need to have on their plates right now. So Turkey was another time of me being able to witness it firsthand and do some reporting. And then for my university, I've been researching it as well. I'm specifically focusing on the migratory pathway for male migrants and its correlation with international humanitarian law, which is complex in itself. But yeah, so far that's been my experience in this field.
Thank you, Rina. That's really helpful. And it's actually reminded me of something I meant to say, which is that normally what we'll try and do is we will try and get a panel with a wide variety of experiences and a diversity of backgrounds. And something I've found with this session is that a lot of people who were originally very interested in participating in, a lot of people pulled out fairly close to the day because they were worried about appearing and speaking out. And that was especially the case amongst people who are very much on the front line. And that really says something, I think, both about the nature of pushbacks and the increasing criminalization of humanitarians that we're seeing at the moment. So both, I'd very much like to express my gratitude to all of you for appearing today, but also I think that is a really important aspect of this whole issue. And that's why our first webinar this month, a couple of weeks ago, was about the criminalization of humanitarians. Antash, how about your experiences and the kind of trends that you've seen in recent years?
Yeah, so I don't want to bore the audience with terminological stuff, but I would like to make a distinction, at least from my point of view, between two phenomena that are quite distinct, especially from a legal point of view. The result is obviously the same, but from a legal point of view, they are quite distinct. One which I would call administrative pushback, where there is actually some kind of procedure where the authorities fail to record that the person asked for asylum, or they actually record that the person did not ask for protection. And then on the paper, everything looks fine and the authorities carry out things in accordance to the law. The person never asked for protection, so they just use the readmission agreement or return them officially to another country. And I think that is a phenomena that has been present for decades in many countries in Europe. And that has been the case also in Hungary, albeit not at extreme proportions, but it was there. The Hungarian Helsinki Committee is a UNHCR implementing partner in Hungary, and we have had a tripartite agreement to conduct border monitoring between the Hungarian border guards, UNHCR, and us. And part of these monitoring activities, we're actually looking into these case files and trying to spot, recurring characteristics of brief interviews, of interviews having been conducted at the same time, officially by the same interpreter, which is quite clearly impossible, or actually be present during those hearings and so on. And then there is the other kind of pushbacks, mainly things where I unfortunately had to become an expert on, which is where there is absolutely no procedure taking place. It's absolutely extrajudicial. The persons are not recorded in any official database, in any official registry. And of course, many of these pushbacks are also violent and extremely violent. And you have the case of Hungary, which is quite unique in Europe, but also I think on a global scale, it's a unique case because in 2016, in July, Hungary actually legalized collective expulsions. So despite the Hungarian constitution explicitly forbidding the collective expulsion of aliens, Parliament adopted a law which practically legalized that. And after March 2017, this legalization has been extended from the original land border area to the entire territory of the country, meaning anyone without the right to stay found on the territory of Hungary doesn't have the right to seek asylum, is not registered, is not interviewed, is not issued with any kind of administrative decision. According to domestic legislation, they have to be transported to the external side of the Hungarian-Serbian border fence, which is practically a pushback to Serbia. And then that really changed a lot, because that also means the Hungarian authorities are no longer required to come up with creative ways to draw up a paper trail where they claim that the person never asked for protection, we did everything according to the law, because you don't have a paper trail at all. And then the trends that you were asking, I was, before I joined the Helsinki committee, I worked as a volunteer and then as a coordinator of volunteers at one of the train stations in Budapest in the summer of 2015, helping people on the move. And I have heard very few stories and complaints about ill treatment by Hungarian police officers at the time. And in the beginning of June 2016, a Syrian boy drowned at the Hungarian-Serbian border. And we provided representation to his surviving brother. And that was the first case when I personally got acquainted with police violence, because that was a violent pushback and the boy drowned in the river as a result of the violent pushback. And that was still before this practice became legal, not the violence, but the pushback. And since July 2016, I've been going almost on a monthly basis, except for the past COVID times, obviously. But I've been going on at least a monthly basis to northern Serbia to document these cases and also to collect evidence in order to litigate individual cases. And I want to highlight two trends, and I'm going to stop after that. But one is that violence became very extreme over the years. It started with minor beatings, with kickings, but not serious injuries. It was also discriminate in the beginning. So women and children were not beaten. And by now we got to the point, I came back 3 weeks ago, the last time I was there, we got to the point that a group of visibly and also legally speaking unaccompanied children were beaten by police officers, a group of 8 unaccompanied children, but women as well. So that's one of the trends, that the violence is becoming more extreme. The other trend is that at the same time that pushbacks became the law in Hungary and the practice, any kind of legal effective access to the asylum procedure became impossible. And if you put the two things together, you have a massive surge in pushbacks and in denial of access to the territory, to the procedure. And at the same time, the system is continuously rebuilt and created and amended in a way that makes it impossible for even the most genuine asylum seekers to ask for protection in Hungary. That shows, I think, a rather bleak future in Europe if we allow these practices to continue.
Thank you, Andras. That's really helpful, and it's both very disappointing and really worrying that an EU country has actually chosen to legalize collective expulsion, despite the obvious injustice of that kind of act.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Daniel, just one thing regarding the criminalization, and that's very important what Rina brought up here. We have a law since 2018, since 1st of July 2018, that, among other things, specifically criminalizes border monitoring for human rights purposes. So it is penalized with up to 1 year in prison. The law is hanging over our head as Damocles' sword. No one has been sent to prison, but the law is in effect, it's there, and it can be used anytime against anyone. And that is also, I think, fitting into this trend that states are trying to hinder any kind of assistance, be that humanitarian assistance or legal assistance, or even just the documentation of these excessive human rights violations. And then on the other side of the border, for the Serbians, it's very clear, unfortunately, over the past couple of years, the continuous regular harassment of volunteers who work there, and they are themselves becoming victims of deportation and expulsion decisions.
Definitely, yeah. The criminalization is also a really worrying trend. I'll just move us on to the second question now, though, which is very much about what you've all said, actually, which is, what do you believe has caused the increasing use of pushbacks at national borders, and indeed the increasing brutality of those pushbacks as well? And rather than go in order this time, I think it would be really good just to get a discussion going and just to hear from all of you. So I don't know if there's anyone who feels comfortable in kind of starting us off with the reason for these very worrying trends.
Okay, shall I start? Shall I take the floor? I don't know. I will give a very easy answer. That's the migration crisis, the so-called migration crisis or refugee crisis, or whatever you want to call it. I think that's the increasing, that's an obvious answer, of course, the increasing migratory pressure over the European borders. And I see a link, a connection with the increased use of pushback practices by the European states. I think we can maybe try somehow to measure these by looking at the case law of the Court of Strasbourg. As I pointed out before, I'm a bit into the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. If we have a look at the case law about the prohibition of collective expulsion of aliens, which is Article 4 of Protocol number 4, it has been pointed out before. This provision was introduced in 1963. That's the year of the adoption of the Protocol number 4. So it's many decades ago. But this prohibition of collective, let's say collective pushbacks, collective expulsion, basically has remained inactive for many decades, have been sleeping, so to say, for so many decades. And it is now being used basically only recently, only in the last years, in the last decade. Let's say the first violation found by the court was in the case Conca versus Belgium in 2002. So that's basically 40 years later than the adoption of this provision. And the litigation now in Strasbourg involving Article 4 of Protocol is on the rise. And this litigation is exploding right now, especially because I think of the migratory pressure that states are facing, and they are reacting with pushback practices. The litigation has been increased exactly from, let's say, 2011-12 onwards. I'm sure you all know the case Irsi versus Italy, the case Claifia versus Italy, and so on. So that's more or less the period in which the consequences of the outbreak of the war in Syria, of the Arab Springs, and so on, the consequence of these international events start to have repercussions on the external borders of the European Union. And also, I would add that it is interesting to look at not only the timing of this case law, not only of the chronological aspect of this case law about collective expulsions in Strasbourg, but also it is interesting to look at the geography, so to say, of this case law. Because if we have a look at the geography of this case law, basically all the member states that find themselves on the perimeter of the European Union, the external perimeter with the external borders of the European Union, all of them have been called before the judges in Strasbourg to defend themselves against possible accusations of collective expulsion of aliens. In the first place, mainly the Mediterranean countries, southern Mediterranean countries, including Italy, Greece, but also Malta, Cyprus, and so on. Spain, we all know the case ND and NT versus Spain more recently. And now, currently, for the time being, it's the turn of Eastern countries, Eastern European countries with land borders. So we have Poland, we have Hungary, there are pending cases against Croatia, and so on. So from a chronological and geographical point of view, I think that looking at the case law of the Court of Strasbourg, it gives us a signal of the litigation about pushback in this field that is particularly active right now. So this would be some remarks I would make for our debate.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I could continue. We are all used to the order introducing us, so I continue. I fully agree to what has been said before by Francesco, so I don't want to repeat the issues. Perhaps we can see the development of the jurisprudence regarding mass expulsion and Article 4, Protocol 4. Before we only had non-refoulement regarding deportations and also rejections, pushbacks at the borders. And we had the development of Article 3 of the Convention, and later on death penalty and non-refoulement. And then we had the interesting development where mass expulsion, the prohibition of or collective expulsion, to be precise, was used to, so to say, to prevent that persons are sent back without giving them the possibility to apply for asylum or to get an individual decision on the application of the person to be allowed to enter the country. In general, one reason was, as Francesco said, the migration crisis. And with this migration crisis, it became obvious that states more and more tended to avoid that the persons are present on the territory, because presence on the territory means even if they are not legally present, you have to carry out a deportation procedure. In Europe, you have to carry out a Dublin procedure to have a Dublin transfer. It's a legal procedure, fortunately, with the possibility to have a remedy against. So it means a certain time of presence of the persons on the territory. It means responsibility. It means taking care of the person with accommodation, medical care, and so on and so forth. And then we had the cases where it was not allowed to transfer persons to Greece, you know, with different consequences they had because of, it was before that, when we follow a clear timeline, but this was a reason as well. And I remember it quite well. I wrote a short summary about the European Council conclusions of 2018. I think they are a good indication for the political will. After the migration crisis in 2015, 2016, and continuing, the European Council had the excellent idea, it's not my opinion that this is excellent, to cooperate with third countries to have landing, what they call landing platforms, and I have to read it. I have it in a minute. Just landing platforms and centers in third countries where asylum application should be processed. And they were quite ambitious, so to say, to establish them in the near future. But most of the third states said, no, not with us. We don't want to have these platforms and camps. And also international lawyers said, no, that's not easy, that you have the responsibility, you have the obligation, you have the extraterritoriality issue, and so on and so forth. And they didn't do it. And one couldn't hear anything new. Just recently, they again came up, our minister came up with the idea again and said, this would be an excellent idea. We don't want them on the territory, but the claim should be processed anywhere. So I think that's a reason as well, not to avoid the presence on the territory. Better to pay, better to support other states, better to whatever do and say, okay, we help to protect them, but they are not on the territory and we don't have all the obligations. And they are not visible, so to say, to people here.
That's very true. And I think that you were right to bring up other aspects like non-refoulement and things like that, because this really is part of a wider failure of states to meet their duty of care, isn't it?
There are many more reasons, but it seems to me these are really important reasons.
Yeah, and you know, I think along with what has been said, I think obviously one of the main reasons, and which has been brought up as well, is you know, increased nationalism and, you know, this very, you know, this idea that this country, the state, only belongs to a very specific group of people, and you know, that gets especially complex when it comes to ethnic tribes as well. So, you know, speaking for Pakistan and Afghanistan themselves. And also with host countries as well, the tensions between, for example, Greece and Turkey, who is more responsible for hosting refugees, who should be getting the appropriate EU funding, and so on and so forth. And yeah, actually, and just I made a note here about, yeah, the increase of pushbacks. I mean, I can say for here at the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan that it has been increasing. There's been an increase in anti-Afghan sentiment here due to recent attacks in both countries, and various reasons, Pakistan's proxy war in Afghanistan, and the list goes on. But yeah, it's worrying, it's worrying, it's a worrying trend. And as stated before, the pushbacks have been getting more and more violent. It's been getting increasingly difficult to, document and report them without, getting caught, getting stuck in the criminalization process of it. And, even with legal aid organizations, it's also been difficult with what type of questions that organizations want to ask. And as someone that's been part of being that middle person and taking formal and informal testimonies, or even just talking to individuals that have been pushed back, it's hard to ask what type, it's hard to ask sensitive questions, but, not due to just what emotions that they will bring up, but also culturally, there are things that I, as a brown woman, cannot ask an Afghan or Pakistani man, or, something that they wouldn't even talk about within our own cultures, something that I wouldn't even talk about within, with my own family members. And so as these pushbacks increase, and as I hear more and more people from this region wanting to go up through the Balkans or through other areas, it's worrying, but people still, and, I can personally say that people here still say that, oh, well, my uncle or so-and-so has made it, so I'll make it. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. So yeah.
I would just bring in another aspect, especially from, I view the world from Hungary, and I think it's heavily related to the deterioration of the rule of law, not just in Hungary, but in many of these countries, and the impunity, the fact that states can get away with this practice. The issue here is you always had denial of access to territory. You always had unlawful expulsions. You always had breaches of the principle of non-refoulement. The problem, it's of course it's a problem anyway, but when it becomes a huge problem is when these become the rule, not the exception. And that's what you're seeing in the case of Hungary, absolutely, but also growingly in Croatia. The Polish situation, the reason I would not list it here, despite having significant rule of law problems there, is that if you look at the Polish asylum situation as a whole, you can't say that there is absolutely no access to the system. There is serious issue at the Belarusian Polish border, as Francesco pointed out. Those are very important cases. And I also want to say that the method of litigation that our Polish colleagues at the Polish Helsinki used there, Rule 39s, requesting interim measures to ensure that people have the right to make an asylum application, at least. That was very beautiful and brilliant and very innovative. But so it is really tied to the rule of law, because at the end of the day, what is happening here, it is in breach of the Geneva Convention, it is in breach of the ECHR, but it is in breach of EU law as well. And in the case of Hungary, I'm not familiar with the Croatian constitution, but it is actually in breach of the country's own fundamental law. And that's where the whole rule of law breakdown comes in, that this can go on. And there is another aspect that might be in play, at least in some countries. When you have growing social tensions inside a country, when you have a growing frustration within the law enforcement agencies, for example, you have to have a way to let the pressure out. And I might not be very popular with this thought, but I'm very concerned that the impunity I and my colleagues are seeing regarding the violence at the Hungarian-Serbian border. So I'm not even talking about the pushback part, about the systemic police violence that occurs there with absolute impunity. This can't go on without the tacit approval of their superiors and, at the end of the day, of the political leadership. And that brings me to a question of why is it in the interest of law enforcement superiors, but also government politicians, to allow this to continue for 5 years now? I mean, these people are, at the end of the day, the same police officer who is going to stop me and ID me on the street, or from whom I'm going to ask for assistance if there is a burglary. And because of what my original PhD or research is focusing on, I can clearly see who is the victim here, so don't get me wrong. But if you are a perpetrator of violence, that also leaves a mark on you. And this is going to stay with us, and I'm not talking about the legal aspects, but this is going to stay with us in Hungary for a very, very long time. That's only partly related to rule of law breakdowns that leads to a very, very dark forest. Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. We actually had a discussion a month or two ago about moral injury and being morally compromised by your work. And yes, of course, you're absolutely right that the victims are those being pushed back. But there are also wider societal issues when, as you say, every level of the hierarchy needs to actually approve this kind of behavior in order for it to continue unimpeded. So I suppose my next question for everyone would be, what effects does this have on both on migrants and on migration in general? But before we move on to answer that, I'll just say that if anyone would like to follow us and learn about other webinars that we run 2 every month, then I've posted our social media into the chat. So please do take a look at that. We will be looking at some really interesting topics over the next few months, so do keep an eye on our social media. But yes, who would like to start? Well, maybe shall we stick to our established order since people... Oh no, Ulrike, please do go ahead.
No, I just want to add one sentence to the previous question. I think we forgot the important, what they call a pull factor. To have, I mean, if you see the pushbacks, you will... it should prevent persons from trying to enter the country. And the pull factors are always a very important element in a political decision, so to say, to give a clear indication, no entrance to the territory. And, yeah. They had it in the council conclusions of 2018, and following always we want to avoid to create the pull factors.
Thank you. Yeah, so what effects do pushbacks have on migrants and migration?
All right, I can, yes, take the floor again. Well, I would, well, many, of course, effects and repercussions, but maybe I would come back a bit to what Andras said about violence, this issue of violence at the borders, which is absolutely worrying. And exactly, I'm not sure this is being dealt with sufficiently and adequately. Also, we have mentioned maybe a couple of times these recent cases about Poland and pushbacks of applicants of asylum seekers to Belarus. And here I had the chance of a bit of working with those cases with the Polish judge as well. Something that the Court of Strasbourg here says is, okay, there is a systemic practice, there is an administrative general practice of pushing back migrants, that's collective expulsions, that's it's not in compliance with the convention and the case law, and that's fine. But what the court here is not doing, and I think it misses the point, is assessing a possible violation of the convention at the borders, in the treatment, exactly in the treatment that asylum seekers receive at the border. And what is striking is that the court in its judgments only says, well, we already found that here there is an issue of pushback, of refoulement, because it's dangerous, sending these persons back to Belarus is dangerous. There might be a risk in terms of Article 3 and so on. So we already found that. So therefore, it is not necessary to examine the treatment that they actually received by the Polish borders. And that's problematic. It's absolutely necessary. On the contrary, that's a different, to me, that's a different profile. That's a different aspect. That's a different violation of Article 3. So I would say that one of the effects is indeed this violence that asylum seekers receive at borders in Croatia as well, which, however, is not sufficiently dealt with. Why? Also because I think there is a problem in terms of evidence. Migrants have difficulties in sometimes or often in providing evidence and evidentiary matters of the violence and of the treatment they receive at borders. There are reports about border authorities taking away, especially, for example, mobile phones of asylum seekers. Many migrants are young persons. They have a mobile phone. They use the social media. They can record the video of what is happening at the border and so on. But border authorities specifically confiscate these items, and it's hard to collect evidence, and it's even hard to prove what happened at the border. So I think that one problematic trend and aspect is violence happening at the border. Then we have the pushback issue and the refoulement issues and the collective expulsions issues, but we have a first initial stage, that is how they are treated at the borders. And this is not, I think, sufficiently taken into consideration.
Sorry if I may react quickly to Francesco, what you said about this. I agree with you on the importance of this, but I'm not sure I agree on the reasons why it's not being litigated. And I can give you concrete examples. There was a case we just won 3 weeks ago, the Kuram Shazad versus Hungary. That's the first Article 4, Protocol 4 case against Hungary. And our client was not only pushed back, but he was horribly beaten. But because you have to exhaust the domestic remedies, meaning you have to file a complaint to the police, there has to be an investigation, there has to be an end to that investigation. And after that, if you are as a victim or a representative of a victim, you are still unsatisfied, then you can go to Strasbourg. That's one of the problems. So, I mean, our client's Article 3 case is a separate case. It's pending with the court. The observation procedure is already over. We expect a judgment in probably, hopefully, a year. But you have that problem. The second problem is what you actually say about the evidence. And the evidence is there. The problem is that it takes 5 minutes to beat up a person with batons, but it takes 2-3 working days for one attorney to collect all the evidence and then try to pursue a criminal case, which, because of the political will to stop people from accessing protection, many of these cases are going to be placed ad acta and no proper investigation will be conducted. So the amount of time needed to uncover just one case is absolutely unproportional to the time that the perpetrators need to exert violence. So there is also that. And lastly, I'm very happy that you are so involved with the court, because I think it will soon become a problem that the court will have to deal with. And this is something we already brought up in a TPI we did in the Medina case, a pushback case against Croatia, where actually young Medina died on at the border between Serbia and Croatia as a result of the pushback. And one of the things that we are arguing there is that Strasbourg had to deal with in the past over disappearance cases, forced disappearance cases, mainly in Chechnya, but also in Turkey. And there, the lack of evidence of what actually happened to the person was seen as a kind of indicator for the court that the person has actually been forcibly made to disappear. And how to turn this logic around and apply it to border violence cases or to Article 4, Protocol 4 cases is, I think, an important intellectual challenge for attorneys, but also for the court, because that problem is there and will be there, not just with violence, but also with Article 4, Protocol 4 cases.
Thank you. That's a really interesting discussion. I don't know, Ulrike, have you got something you'd like to add to that?
I will be quite brief about my issues. I tried, at least. I think we have a new situation for a couple of weeks, months now, at the Lithuanian-Belarusian border, where, you know, they erect a new fence in Europe, one of the new fences, where we have mainly Belarusian nationals who want to flee to Lithuania. Lithuania is a small country, the asylum system is there, but not really, I mean, not much practice so far. The numbers are quite low, higher than in other Baltic countries, but lower than everywhere. So we will see what the development is. But I mean, when you hear the Commission, you say, okay, they will support Lithuania. When we heard our minister, they said we will support them with erecting the fence. That's the situation now. So, I mean, the political will of some countries is not supported, not solidarity. Though we in Austria especially say we'll have refugees from Czechoslovakia decades ago, from Hungary decades ago, but now from Belarus, a regime, you know, no democracy at all. We help them with erecting a fence. Yeah, what effects on migrants and the situation? I think it will be more difficult for migrants, but the avoidance of a pull factor will not really help. I mean, migrants will come, refugees will come, of course, and it will be more difficult to access protection, to access a country. We will again see an increase, or at least no decrease, of detention, sometimes quite a long detention. And, you know, all of you are familiar with Strasbourg jurisprudence. We all know the case law of Strasbourg is not encouraging with regard to detention. When you see, for example, the Hungarian case in the help me when I pronounce it not in the correct way, with the Röschke Center, or we will have increased detention, and increased detention outside the European Union. We see Bosnia, for example, where the person sent back or pushback from Austria ended up for the time being. And another issue which we didn't deal with is the Spanish case ND and NT, where the court made an interesting link between saying, okay, the applicants were involved in what the court said a culpable conduct, because they tried to storm the fence and they were violent, they committed violent acts, and therefore they had a culpable conduct. So if the court develops this jurisprudence, it was heavily criticized, of course, then we could see negative consequences, but nobody knows about developments in jurisprudence. But this connection was really dangerous for refugee protection, I would say.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And yes, of course, nobody can predict for certain, but I think between you, the four of you have more expertise than any other group I've come across on this subject. So it's fascinating to hear your thoughts on it. Rina, is there anything you'd like to add to this question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, of course, I think that the effect this has on migration in itself is that it'll get more complex. And what, for example, with the use of more Frontex personnel, border walls, security, all of that, we've been seeing an increase in not only in the Balkans, but here as well. And I think the effects it has on migrants is, as stated earlier, is that how they're treated at borders. That's what I've seen, is that, when talking to people that don't work in this field and, know very little about it, that's a huge thing that they don't know about, is that, pushbacks and, the brutality, like that's something that doesn't come often on the mainstream media. So as the pushbacks, increase, and this has a huge effect on migration in itself by making the pathway more difficult. I think for migrants, it's tough because with with what the situation is in most of the home countries, that in itself has been getting also really difficult, and it's creating, it's forcing people to leave and leaving them with no other choice. So when they're forced to flee, and then you already have a pathway that's even more complex than ever, where does that leave them? Where does that leave the individuals that, provide aid? Where does that leave those that provide legal assistance, and so on and so forth?
Absolutely. And I think there's a real problem there with as the jurisprudence and as the individual border guard actions and everything in between get harsher and harsher, it's going to become more normalized and people will feel more comfortable with it. And as you mentioned, Rina, there's so little reporting on it at the moment, although there has been a bit of an uptick recently, I think, but there's still so little that most people are ignorant of it. And most people I talk to who aren't in our sector, they just think, oh, well, it's fine, they shouldn't be coming here illegally or something. And there's no concept of either the nuance of the situation or indeed the fact that pushbacks are, for the most part, entirely illegal.
There is another thing, and that's one of the most outrageous part of this story. So the more pushbacks become the rule and not the exception, the more people, and I'm talking about despite Europe having always experienced mixed migratory flows here, but I would in this sense focus on people in genuine need of protection, that even those people are forced into the hands of smugglers and organized crime groups, because if there is no legal way to ask for asylum, even if you are the most genuine person in need of protection, then you are left with that. You are left with smugglers if you are able to afford that, or you are left as a victim of human trafficking. And that in the 21st century, this is something that European governments are encouraging, are actually strengthening. It's just mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. Especially on the Balkan route, which I know more about, the organized crime groups have been present historically for centuries. And to see that even after the end of the Balkan Wars, when arms smuggling and arms dealing was no longer a flourishing business, after 2015, these groups very clearly turned onto migrants and migration. And if you would go today to northern Serbia, even to semi-anti-official Serbian camps, it's shocking to see the reality in that sense. And it's not just, you know, a human rights crisis that is the result of pushbacks. It's a very serious security crisis as well that pushbacks are through this actually create. And that's something that decision makers are not really thinking about. So what's happening here is that we are not simply, you know, sacrificing human rights on the altar of whatever notion of security we believe, but it's actually the sacrifice of both human rights and security at the altar of, I don't know, nationalistic or anti-refugee rhetorics. And it's just horrific to see.
Thank you, Andras. I'm really glad to hear you mention that, actually, because in some ways for me that is the most frustrating thing when talking to people who are ignorant of this issue, is hearing people talk about how people shouldn't come here illegally, and then I just want to ask them, well, how do people come here legally? We, as you say, we have, obviously not we, but states have successfully cut off most, or in some cases all, of the legal routes to claim asylum. So what are people expected to do? And I find that very frustrating, how many people don't seem to be aware of that. I think that's also, I mean, I really appreciated your passion there, Andras, and I wonder if that's maybe a good place to begin bringing the discussion to a close, because I'm conscious we're already over our time slightly. Does anyone have any last thoughts they would like to share on the subject?
Yes, perhaps one issue I didn't know myself. I saw a report about the recent Austrian judgment of decisions, and I saw there is a network in Austria where they do monitoring. So perhaps in other states where we have a more recent practice of pushbacks, or an increasing practice. We always had practice, but now it's increasing, and the court had issued interesting decisions. Perhaps this could be an example for good practice to establish networks. There are obviously networks in Hungary, Serbia, but perhaps to include other countries where you see there is an increased number of pushbacks as well.
Just to clarify, Ulrike, are you thinking in terms of bringing more collective actions to the ECHR and things like that? Is it that kind of collaboration you're referring
Perhaps
to?
as a consequence, yes.
Yeah, that would be really good. It's something that's really struck me hearing all of you today, is that we have 4 dedicated and passionate professionals working in 4 different countries, and all of you doing great stuff. And yeah, it would be brilliant to be able to bring people together more and to be able to kind of foster more collaboration. But of course, it's always difficult in this sector, because where do we find the time? Does anyone else have anything they'd like to say before we sign off? No? Okay, well, we can bring it to a close there then. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our brilliant panelists. I've really appreciated hearing all your perspectives, and I've already privately been receiving some very positive feedback from our audience members. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us. We will be uploading the video of this webinar to YouTube tomorrow, and we'll share it on our social media then. So please do share it if you know people who weren't able to make it today but would still like to see it. Please do keep an eye on our social media for our upcoming webinars. In August, we'll be talking about humanitarian well-being and looking at both individual and institutional solutions to the problems of kind of humanitarian burnout and things like that. So do join us for those discussions. And yeah, thank you so much, all of you. I've really enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank
the
you very
invitation.
much.
Thanks very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye to everybody.